All right, so let's turn to our political panel here, and let's talk about foreign policy and Donald Trump, because it wasn't that long ago, Steve, you and I were talking about this, the fact that Donald Trump gave a foreign policy address in Washington, which was very different from what we had seen in previous Donald Trump appearances, where there was a teleprompter, a very set script. He did not really stray from those remarks. And it was actually received warmly by a top Republican, right, on Capitol Hill.
Right, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee on the Senate side. And, you know, he basically listened to it and said, this is something I can work with, which is positive at the time.
It was surprising to some people, right?
Think about where we were a few weeks ago when that speech happened, which is we were discussing Republican unity. Is there going to be such a thing? So for that chairman of that committee to listen to this speech and say that, it was a big moment for Trump. Maybe he should have had a teleprompter in this interview with Reuters. I don't know. But you know, the question I have, at least with, do we know that voters want these specifics, right? If it's going to be an election about foreign policy and specifics about U.S. foreign policy, then it's probably going to be a pretty easy election for Hillary Clinton. But as we know, it's going to be a lot more than that, right? And so the question is do they want to know that Donald Trump knows all this about foreign policy, knows all the details, has explicit ideas of what he wants to do, or are they fine with the fact that he just has vague ideas of what he wants to do, but he's talking tough and he's going to make America great again, as he says, right? That's the question. Is it going to be the slogan or is it going to be the details? Right now, at least what we've seen, at least within the Republican primary process, the slogans seem to have won out on that one. And if you look, it wasn't exactly about the details. Republican voters were fine with Trump. In fact, he won among the idea of who can handle foreign policy better. Most Republicans thought that Trump could. So it wasn't necessarily the specifics he was talking about. It was more about the general idea that he'll be better at foreign policy than the other candidates. Does that translate into a general election? We'll find out.
Yeah, I mean, what about that, Rick? I mean, is there an appetite for specifics here? Steve, I should say, Steve Chigueras, our senior political editor, whom I neglected to introduce there a moment ago, but he's with us. Is this a moment, you think, where there is call for these kind of specifics on foreign policy?
Yeah, I think there are certain criteria that you got to meet, and one of them is, you know, what does it take to be commander-in-chief? What does it take to be the world's most powerful leader? And Trump knows that for the purposes of winning a primary, that's all he needed to do. So, you know, he was able to get by with, you know, pretty glossy rhetoric about our enemies abroad. And what's interesting is he's kind of defining the world as all the despots and people who hate America are the people he thinks he can get along with. And yet, you know, all our allies are really upset with him these days and yelling at him on TV all the time. So it really is an interesting dynamic. I mean, there's actually been quite a bit of foreign policy news this week on this campaign. So I think that the question for his campaign, and what was exemplified by the speech that he gave in Washington a couple weeks ago, is what do we need? What are the minimum basic requirements to get that box checked on being commander-in-chief and a leader of the free world? What do we got to do so that voters say, okay, I got it? Now, Steve's right. I don't think foreign policy is going to play a major role in this campaign. Certainly Hillary Clinton will want it to, because she's got all this great, you know, success and experience there. But it is clear that this campaign is being waged by people who are saying, you know what, the guy's tough on Washington. He's going to throw the bums out. He's going to start over all over again. He's going to give us greatness. To his voters today, and it's a growing group, that's the trade. We're going to trade off his inexperience for the fact that he's actually going to get something done. And pollster after pollster will tell you that has become more important to voters than any single issue, whether it's social issues, economic issues, or foreign policy issues.
I just remember in 2000, the amount of time we spent focused on George W. Bush and his lack of foreign policy knowledge. You'll never forget that interview that he did with the reporter up in Boston, where he couldn't name foreign leaders, right? And everybody was like, this is the end of George W. Bush as a presidential candidate. Well, it wasn't the end, right? I think most Americans probably don't know that information as well, right? And so I think that there actually might have been a moment there where people said, as long as he can lead this country, it doesn't matter that he doesn't know the specifics. We're not going to hold that against him. And so In this case, it may be something similar. We don't know. I mean, we'll see what happens over the course of the next few months.
You know, I had a line I wrote in Los Republicanos in my first book. I was talking about kind of like ethnic communities coming and joining, enlisting in the military. And I said, these are families that may not be able to identify the hot spot on a map, on a world map, but they're the first to enlist when our country's in trouble. And I think in many ways we have to remember what we're talking about. These are individuals, fundamentally, the punctuation point is that they want to see that the American symbol remains an American eagle and not a sitting duck. And it's this kind of strength that they feel was lacking under the last 8 years of this administration that is very much speaking to this idea. So they're willing to kind of like broad stroke this foreign policy and give the benefit of the doubt. If Trump can secure strong leaders, you got the Dick Cheney, you know, kind of endorsement. If he can get strong leaders behind him who have a better command of the issue.
Well, but I think the they that we're talking about right now, we just have to keep remembering is the primary electorate, and so we don't know what's going to happen when we make that pivot into the general, and a whole different category and a whole different group of people are paying attention. Will these things matter? Will it matter that he said, hey, you know, nuclear anti-proliferation policies aside, doesn't really matter to me, don't care. Will it matter that he's thumbing his nose at our quote-unquote special relationship with England? I mean, we don't know, because right now all the findings that we have are with a very, very different kind of electorate.
If it comes down to what Leslie says, then, right, that's not going to be a good thing for Hillary Clinton, because she's emblematic of the last 8 years of Obama foreign policy, right? She was the Secretary of State for 4 years. So she will be fully blamed for that. Of course, if it's the opposite and people want somebody who's experienced and want somebody who understands this, then that's going to benefit her. But we don't know how that's going to break yet, right? That's something
you have the Benghazi issue, which
well,
is also the pall hanging over the campaign. I mean, if that wasn't there, that's why.
Which is going to be an issue, and Trump has already started in on that. It's not. He's not going to let up, right?
Actually, I think not only does she own the 8 years of the Obama administration and crises like that didn't work out very well, but she's going to own the 8 years of the Clinton administration. And Bill Clinton signed an agreement with the North Koreans in 1994 to, quote, get them to stop building a nuclear weapon, and we paid them billions of dollars to do it. And how'd that agreement work out? And this is exactly the kind of thing that Trump will respond to. He'll say, you know, if he actually knew that they'd signed an agreement.
He will now, Rick.
Is it, you know what, you say I shouldn't talk to the North Koreans? Bill Clinton signed an agreement with them, and they made him look like a patsy, right? They didn't do a thing and got paid billions of dollars, and they still have a weapons program. If you're Donald Trump, you say, you know what? I don't know if I'm ever going to give the guy a nickel, but I'll make sure he doesn't have any nuclear weapons. And you know, by the way, believable, because the plan that Bill Clinton put in place was a disaster. Didn't affect a single change in North Korea. And he did a deal with the guy. He signed an agreement. So Trump is saying, all I'm talking about is, you know, talking to the guy, and yet everyone's all worked up. Bill Clinton signed an agreement that wasn't worth the price of the paper it was printed on.
What about this meeting that's set to take place on Wednesday, Donald Trump meeting with former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger? I mean, what would be the definition of quote-unquote success for Donald Trump coming out of that meeting?
Henry Kissinger endorsement, which
Besides
I'm not going to hold my breath for that one. No, it's interesting because it's all part of this. I have people who I talk to who I learn, right? So he's going from Sunday shows where he learns most of his foreign policy, national security from, to the guy who actually is on most of the Sunday shows, at least in the old days. And so having these kinds of meetings and surrounding himself with people who have the gravitas that he doesn't have helps give him the impression to voters that he'll manage that properly. And again, he's not trying to solve the world's problems. He's trying to prove to the American public that he can solve the world's problems.
Right. I think that the balance there that he's speaking about is he going to change tone in terms of being reckless? Like are these statements, some of these flubs that he's had, they're just reckless statements or ignorant statements, not really understanding the gravitas of what he's saying. He quickly course corrects and says, well, I really didn't really mean that. But then again, it's the maturing of the campaign. Can they get enough people around them with sound advice? And at least on those issues, he stays on the high notes and not kind of in the weeds.
Yeah, because at one point he talked about Vladimir Putin, and early on he used that word, well, you know, he's a strong leader, and people were aghast in the foreign policy world that he would describe him that way. And he said, well, that doesn't mean I approve necessarily, or that that's a good thing. So I guess it's TBD what it is that the voters will require in terms of wanting specifics on foreign policy at this point. You think that there is just sort of a rudimentary test essentially right now for candidates like him to kind of convince voters that there's not really anything to worry about because he's doing his homework essentially by meeting with Henry Kissinger, by having these kind of interviews where there's a little bit more nuance to his position, although some people clearly disagree with his viewpoint, but he's demonstrating some knowledge of these issues.
Yeah, it's the classic. There'll be the 3 a.m. phone call, right? What's the president doing when he's laying in bed and he gets a 3 a.m. call that there's going to be a terrorist attack, and what is he going to do about it, right? This is now sort of common in every campaign. There'll be an ad on both sides. You know, what would Hillary Clinton do? What would Donald Trump do? And you have to get over that hump, right? You have to prove that you aren't going to freeze when that phone rings or make a bad judgment call. And I would say, considering the mood of the electorate, what we've seen up to this point in time, and the lack of pushback to pretty flippant comments by Donald Trump on foreign policy, is they'll remember the speech, right? And he'll say, hey, I made an articulate speech. Even the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Corker, said I did a good job. And the more he repeats that, the more people say, well, Corker, you know, he knows what he's talking about. He must be okay. And so these third-party endorsements, these third-party proofs of his capacity to give a speech or meet with Henry Kissinger are all things that'll go to add up to the overall sum total of him as a candidate.
I mean, I think, though, it comes back to what Steve said, which is if people care about experience, the ball is in Hillary Clinton's court, right? Because if she's going to own the Obama administration, she's also going to own the fact that she can say, hey, I was in the room when we got Osama bin Laden. And, you know, when you contrast that against, hey, I gave an articulate speech on foreign policy, or I was in the room when we got Osama bin Laden, there's just no comparison.
The bad news about that is there hasn't been any evidence, at least on the Republican side of the equation, that anybody gives a hoot about experience, right? I mean, he just beat 17 people who are more experienced than he is on virtually every issue.
Well, and let's talk about foreign policy. Is anybody really voting for Bernie Sanders because of his foreign policy, right? So if the idea is there's a section of each party that's looking for an outsider, looking for somebody who you know, doesn't necessarily exude experience, then it almost doesn't. It might not matter, right? We'll see what happens. I also wanted to say we shouldn't underestimate, by the way, the period we're in right now. Trump didn't expect to be where he is right now. Trump expected to be continuing fighting Ted Cruz and John Kasich, expected to be dealing with primaries, expected to be in Oregon tonight, worrying about that. Instead, he's home in New York, studying up on all this stuff, right? And he's being coached up. If I may, he loves talking about Tom Brady, right? And so he's trying to turn from the rookie that Tom Brady was, drafted in the 6th round, that was just a wild quarterback and couldn't play in the NFL, to somebody who in a year was coached up by Bill Belichick and others to be an MVP, right? That's what Trump is trying to do right now, and he's getting all these meetings. He's got all, and now he has the time that he can focus on this. He's got between now and the convention, and then he can show it off at the convention and then move forward. Now, whether he actually turns into Tom Brady or he turns into I don't know, name your favorite failed presidential candidate or failed quarterback.
That's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it?
But we'll see, right?
Yeah.
But that, I think we can't underestimate what he's doing right now, and then letting really the Democrats sort of have their fight about unity, have their fight about how is Hillary Clinton going to move on from Bernie Sanders.